This is a short, rather idiosyncratic video to help you understand The Great Gatsby and where I'm coming from. I would imagine that even before this course, most of you have read the novel, perhaps in high school. It's a short, easily read staple that seems to show up in high school class after high school class. I think that's when I first read it, but I'm honestly not sure. I'm starting here with the grave of F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda. I should mention, by the way, that his name, Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald, is in fact an old family name. He is related at some distance, but he is related to the writer of the Star-Spangled Banner. He and his wife are buried together in Rockville, Maryland. I should mention this is not their first grave. This is their second. And I should also mention that down here on the bottom, this particular section was added after their death when they created a new tombstone for them, and it contains the last line of Great Gatsby. Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, so like many of us, he's a Midwesterner. In 1896, he was educated in St. Paul and in Buffalo, all at Catholic schools. His parents were Catholic. Um, and he ended up at Princeton in about 1914 and began his studies there. He didn't stay. In 1917, he left. He'd achieved a certain amount of literary success writing short stories. And he had neglected his schoolwork, was placed on academic probation, and left to join the Army after the United States entered the First World War in 1917. He was trained at Fort Leavenworth here in Missouri, just across the Missouri border in Kansas, and then was eventually stationed at an Army camp in Montgomery, Alabama, and that's where he met his wife, Zelda. I put these two different pictures of him up here. First is to give you an idea of what Fitzgerald looked like at the beginning of his writing career. He was a very prolific writer, especially early on, and he ended his life in Hollywood as a screenwriter because that was the place that you could make some money. And Fitzgerald, for a variety of reasons, was almost always broke. Over here on the left, this is Zelda. This is the woman that he fell in love with when he moved to Montgomery. She's a Southerner. They got married very quickly. And they had their first and only child, Francis Scott Fitzgerald, who they called Scotty over here. Here in this picture, she's about 2. This will give you a little bit of idea of sort of what people wore in the 20s, which may help you understand some of the clothing that you see referred to in Gatsby. Their marriage was not a necessarily perfect one, but it was a complicated, loving relationship. Zelda had a variety of mental illness issues. Both of them were alcoholics, although quite functional in many ways. And Fitzgerald also suffered from tuberculosis, which at the time was incurable. There was really nothing you could do about it except move to a place that was a better climate like the Southwest, which is one of the reasons that he moves to California to become a screenwriter. His real reason was to make more money. Zelda's medical expenses were very high. She was in and out of sanatoriums from time to time, and he wrote himself silly trying to support him and his family. Here's a little sort of capture of his history. This was his first book, This Side of Paradise, published in 1921. It was a bestseller, made a carload of money. It was the book that became kind of the model for our notion of the Roaring Twenties. His second book, The Beautiful Linda Dan, was also fairly successful and explored much the same milieu of young, bright things living in the 20s during this period of excess after the First World War. Over here is some Great Gatsby things. This particular cover, The Great Gatsby, was one that was for a volume issued in 1992 of the book. And this was a piece commissioned specifically for it and meant to give you kind of the mysterious eyes that are referred to among the characters, and of course makes a reference at a great distance to the eyes of Dr. G.J. Eckelberg, the optometrist sign that shows up early in the novel and recurs a couple of times. Over here is a sort of a Jazz Age scene that might be reminiscent of one of Gatsby's parties. This was an illustration used in another edition. And then there was a stamp issued not that long ago to commemorate the Great Gatsby, and here it is. It's sort of hard to imagine that one of the books that we're studying is something that would be worthy of a stamp, but there you are. And then down here, of course, is a famous picture of Leonardo DiCaprio when he played Gatsby in the 2013 version of the film, which is not my favorite. There are several films of Gatsby. I'm going to talk about the 1974 one here in a bit, but none of them, I think, really capture the essence of the novel. The novel itself, I think, is almost unfilmable in the sense that it's so difficult to portray the subtle shadings of character and setting and time and language that the book contains. The 1974 one, I think you might find interesting. First, Robert Redford, of course, a much younger Robert Redford than we have now, played Gatsby. Mia Farrow, this is before she was married to Woody Allen and before all of the horrible things that happen in the Woody Allen family come up. This is Myrtle. She's played by an actress named Karen Black. This, of course, is Tom, who's played by Bruce Dern, and you see another picture of him down here. And Bruce Dern almost always plays roles where he's the heavy. And a lot of people say it's because it goes back to a John Wayne movie called The Cowboys, where he shot John Wayne. And they did that very early in his career. I think it was his second film. And ever since then, he's played nothing but evil, bad guys. Here's a picture of Robert Redford with Mia Farrow. This is one of the classic stills of the film. And you can compare it over here to the DiCaprio version with Carey Mulligan playing Daisy. I happen to like this pairing better than this pairing, but I don't think that any of these four characters really carry off their parts as well as they could. The 1974 film features Howard Da Silva as Meyer Wolfsheim, which is kind of an interesting point of comparison. Over here, this is Nick Carraway. He's played by Sam Waterston, a very young Sam Waterston, in one of his earlier film roles. And Lois Chiles plays Jordan Baker. I think sometimes it's helpful to visualize who the characters are and what they look like. I hope this doesn't spoil it for those of you who don't need these kinds of visual aids. But when I'm reading the novel, I have Robert Redford's voice and Sam Waterston's voice going in the back of my head. Even though I don't like the film as much as I would like to, I do find that a compelling vision of the film, of the book, that does give you an idea of this extraordinary series of events in this. Okay. Since you've all read the book, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the plot, but I am going to talk about some of the things that we can look at here as a work of fiction that you might be intrigued by. As we know, Nick Carraway is a first-person narrator, and we all know, we've talked in our other stories about how unreliable that kind of narrator might be. So one of the questions for you to think about might be, well, what makes Nick Carraway someone we should listen to? Should we trust him? Should we believe everything he tells us? I happen to think that he is as objective a narrator as you're going to find. And I say that only because, unlike, say, Sister in Why I Live at the P.O., he's someone who says not so nice things about himself. He admits his mistakes. He admits errors in judgment. And so I think he's telling us the truth in a way that maybe other first-person narrators aren't. Something I think that helps with that is the fact that he says, look, I'm recalling this 2 years after all this happened. And I think that because there's that space there, this is not written in the heat of the moment. We're not reading it as if it just happened like we do in Why I Live at the P.O., but instead we're reading it at a distance, and so it seems a little bit more reliable in my mind. Something else that is interesting about the structure is the switching back and forth of the settings. Some things happen on Long Island, some things happen in New York City. And New York City things, generally speaking, are not always very pleasant. Nobody seems to have a good time when they go there, even though they go there all the time for stuff. Nobody seems very happy there. You could argue that people aren't really happy in West or East Egg for that matter either, although I think once Gatsby and Daisy meet again, and the time they spend in West Egg is extraordinarily happy, of course, until the end of the novel. Something else I think we need to think about is the what many writers or commentators have called the lyric descriptions of people and settings and events in here. The last line's the most famous, but if you look carefully at the novel, you'll see that the language is chosen very carefully, and it presents a particularly not romanticized, but a very vivid portrait of what's happening both in the context of the work and in talking about the setting, but also inside the head of the narrator. We know a great deal about what Nick is thinking, um, and why he thinks what he thinks and how he responds to things. And my sense is that that's one of the things that makes this novel so compelling. At its heart, of course, it's a love story. You know, we've read lots of love stories this semester, some that have not worked out so well and some that have. This particular one is an interesting love story because it's one that in the novel began several years before it happens. Daisy and Gatsby meet like Fitzgerald and Zelda did uh, in when Gatsby was in the Army in Louisville, when he was stationed there during the war before he went off to combat, which is something that Fitzgerald did not do. He was never deployed. The war ended before he could go. But at bottom, it's this love story between these two people. Daisy marries because Gatsby isn't available. She doesn't think he's coming back. When he comes back, it's too late. It's the day before her wedding. We have that crazy scene where she throws the necklace into the trash can and cries uncontrollably, and then the next morning is patched back together and goes through the wedding with Tom. Gatsby enters and wants to return things to where they were in 1918. And that's something that's almost impossible. But that kind of love story, that attachment, I think, is very much the center of the novel. And everything that Gatsby does, everything that Gatsby says is designed to move him and Daisy closer together. Now, you could argue that Gatsby's method, these big parties, this enormous house and stuff, which he's doing to make himself worthy of Daisy and make himself interesting to her, are not very good ideas, but that's what he does. We have a couple of other love stories in here as well. One is the Jordan and Nick story, which ends desultorily. I think Nick is more interested in Jordan, but I think Jordan's more interested in herself. And Nick realizes that she is not the woman for him. In fact, Nick never marries in the course of the story. We have no idea what happens to him after he returns to the Midwest at the end. But their relationship is kind of a foil to the love that Daisy and Gatsby have, where it's sort of an intermediate state. I think the ickiest relationship is clearly the Myrtle-Tom one. And Tom, of course, is a serial adulterer. Um, he goes out with women, usually relatively low-class women. I hate to use the term, but women who aren't in the same social circles that he moves in all the time. I think there's a reference to the first um, such relationship was with a hotel maid when they're on their honeymoon or right after it. And that's the kind of sleazeball that Tom is. He's interested in women for sex only. And of course, we know from some other parts of the thing that he's a racist and he's difficult and stuff. And I often wonder that since Fitzgerald went to Princeton, um, Tom went to Yale and was a football player. You may or may not know this, but Fitzgerald was cut the first day of tryouts for the Princeton football team. So sometimes I think there's a teeny bit of score settling there. But Tom is someone whose greatest years were behind him when he was a football player at Yale. Um, and that's in fact one of the reasons that Nick knows him, is that they were both at Yale at the same time, and he saw him as a football player. But Tom and Myrtle are kind of the lowest level, pure sex, almost animal-like relationship that they have. You could probably maybe put Jordan and Nick in the middle, and Daisy and Gatsby's love kind of at the top of the heap. But none of these relationships are fruitful, are they? None of them are terribly successful. But you've got these three different interlocking stories here, all of which are various forms of romance, from the very basest kind to the most refined. Another question to think about is, does this novel have a hero? Is there a good guy in here? And I think the easy solution to that is say, well, yes, Nick is a good guy. He's the guy who's picking up the pieces. He's the guy who arranges for the funeral for Gatsby. He's the one who kind of cleans things up at the end of the story. And he gets to tell the tale. But there are some other things that he does, like he has some desultory affairs with another woman in his office before he meets Jordan. And he doesn't really distinguish himself at any point and say, well, this is just a load of crap. You guys stop doing this. He never calls anybody out. He just goes along for the ride, literally in some cases, on their trips back and forth to New York. You can think about those scenes at the apartment that Myrtle and Tom use for their trysts early on in the story. And Nick is just a passenger. He's just an observer. He doesn't ever stand up and say, stop. So you can decide whether that's heroic or not, or maybe this is a novel that doesn't have a hero. Bad guys, the novel has quite a few. Tom is the obvious one, but Tom is not, I think he lacks the capacity to be a really good bad guy because he's not self-aware. He's just who he is. I think he has a very limited sense of the world around him. We see him as a racist. We see him as a serial adulterer. We don't see him as a very good husband. We have no idea what his business life is like. But maybe Tom is not really a bad guy so much as he's just who he is. Meyer Wolfsheim is an easy person to dislike because he's a gangster. And it may very well be the case that because of the way that Meyer uses Gatsby as kind of a front for his business deals, that we might look at Meyer as a figure of evil or a bad guy. But I'm not so sure about that. If you think about it, um, there's always somebody behind the money business who we don't like very much in both in our lives and in fiction. And so guys who are good at that tend to be seen as perhaps bad guys because they might put the love of money before anything else. But on the other hand, those are the guys who make the world work in one way or another. I think of that wonderful line from Balzac that behind every great fortune lies a great crime. And perhaps that's what's going on here as well. Horatio Alger is probably somebody you guys may never have heard of, but he was a novelist in the late 19th century. Wrote books called Ragged Dick and others that were all about boys of low circumstances with no education, by dint of hard work and effort, becoming self-made men. And Gatsby's very much like this. He comes from a poor family in the Midwest. You know, we meet his dad at the end of the book at the funeral. He doesn't come from much of anything, but because when he's taken in by Dan Cody and then by Meyer Wolfsheim after the war, he's made into this extraordinarily attractive American character. And so he is kind of a self-made man, but he may have done it not in a way that somebody like, I don't know, Samuel Morse or Thomas Edison did. He's a guy who understands how the world works and understands his place in it. And so he does really come from nothing and turn himself into something. We also forget sometimes that Gatsby is a legitimate war hero. He really did end the war as a major. He really was in charge of the machine guns in his division, and he really did receive decorations for that service, and he also did get to go to Oxford for a few months. So all those things added together make Gatsby a very complex figure. And even though he does some things that we may not like, there's something pure and noble about him and his actions from time to time. Um, and you have to decide whether those outweigh all the fabrications that he tells, all the half-truths, and indeed, you know, all the things that happen to him in the course of the story. I've already talked about this idea of a moral arbiter, whether Nick fits into that category or no one does. And there really isn't any figure in the story that I know of who's the absolute moral center of the book, someone we can use to make judgments about it. And I think that kind of makes Fitzgerald's problem as a writer an interesting one because he has to use this extraordinary language to bring us in to make this story intriguing and attractive to us. But you can decide whether it's balanced too far in one way or too in another. The Week 7 blog posting asked you to consider this question about the great American novel. And I think each of those words is kind of loaded. We can certainly say, yes, the book is a novel. Yes, it was written by an American writer, but is it great? And what's our standard for great? Um, One of my standards, and this is just a Mike Burke thing, is can I read something over and over again and find something I didn't notice before? And I certainly do that with this particular book. I've probably read this book 12 or 15 times over the years. And I was amazed when I was rereading it last week for this course, how much I recalled. Little tiny bits of business, little details, you know, Daisy over his shirts, the the clothes that the women wore, um, the way Jordan Baker is described, what happens at the parties, what happens at the end, I was stunned at how much came back to me and how much has stuck with me in this book. But I do think it also raises some really complex questions about what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be successful? What does it mean to be moral? What's the nature of love? I mean, there's some huge themes in here, and I think these are also themes that any good novel, particularly an American one, has. Another point is something that Nick points out, that all of them, Tom, Daisy, himself, even Gatsby, are all Westerners who've come east. And something happens to them in the East, in New York and the East Coast, um, that may not have been possible anywhere else except where it happened. And so if you think about our country as one of continual westward expansion, as the Spanish and the French and the Dutch and the English landed on the East Coast and then began to move their way west, it may very well be that this is kind of a reversal of that. And because it's a counter-cyclical movement from Midwest to East, it's one that is going to end in a certain level of tragedy. So if you decide that this is a great American novel because it concerns itself with big American themes, that westward passage is one of those extraordinary things that defines us as Americans, problematic though it is. So that reversing that sets things in motion in a way that we might very well decide that things are going to go wrong. So as you finish the novel or read it for the second or third or fourth time, keep some of these things in mind and see what you notice. And also see what I didn't talk about. I could go on for days about this, but these are the things that I thought at this particular moment would be the most useful to you. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that you're glad that you chose this.